Hello, everybody. I am Jo Flick at the Montana State Library, and I'm here with Tracy Cook, and we're going to talk this afternoon about measuring project success for all of our Mind in the Making folks. And so, Tracy, we do want to start though with with little project updates, and also give people a chance to whoop, because we learned to whoop at Mind in the Making, and we want to try to make sure to keep that practice. So we don't have anyone online today, so we're just doing the recording, but we do want you to be able to be thinking about what is happening with the implementation of your Mind in the Making project in your community. Hope you will share that with us here at the State Library. We don't have any pending deadlines or anything, but we will be continuing to meet, and certainly we'll be looking to hear about your projects, and we know that your peers want to hear about them too. So be thinking about that. Feel free to share information with us at the State Library anytime, and that can go to me or Amelia is really the key contact person for Mind in the Making. But for today's topic, you're stuck with Tracy and me. So today's whoop is, so when it comes to measuring project success, what do you wish for? And what is an outcome that you'd like to get from this training or from attempting to measure project success? Think about an obstacle that you may encounter and then a plan to overcome that obstacle. So maybe pause the video right now, maybe write down some responses to that whoop just for yourself, and then come on back and join us when you're ready. So today we're going to really focus in on how you will know what your project has achieved, what you want it to achieve. And we're really going to follow up very much on what Pam and Tracy covered at our last webinar in August about using a logic model and planning for success. So one of the things you need to know about whether or not you're successful is you need to really have a good idea about what success looks like. So we're going to be spending a little bit of time working from those logic models to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about how exactly do you measure progress toward your desired outcomes. And I'm going to share with you some, hopefully, what are, I think, pretty simple ways you can go about doing that. And we'll also talk about some more complex, maybe difficult ways to measure those indicators and measure the progress toward your outcomes. So Tracy, you talked a lot about logic models last time with Pam, so we're going to let you kind of start with that and use a logic model to plan appropriate data, and how that logic model helps you with outcomes and impacts. And I'm going to turn things on over to you.
All right, thanks, Jo. So Pam and I did talk quite a bit about logic models when we were discussing how to plan for your project. It turns out that that same logic model can also be used when you want to measure whether or not you've achieved success with your project. And so just as a reminder, the logic model is the image that appears on the top right-hand side of the slide. The inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Inputs are our resources that we need to implement our project. Our outputs are our deliverables and usage of those deliverables. Outcomes are about a change in a user, and impacts are kind of what that user's change in knowledge or behavior does for the community as a whole. So what I want to kind of spend some time doing today is just talking about how you measure each of these. And I'm going to start with outputs because they're actually the easiest probably to measure and the one I think we're often most familiar with. Outputs, as I mentioned, are your deliverables. And so it might be a handout or a resource that you give to attendees. It might be a class, or it might even be a program that you offer for community members. As part of that, the number of events that you have and the number of people who attend that event are also considered outputs. They're not actually considered outcomes because they're typically numerical. Now, there's some nuances here to outputs and outcomes. That you could say that continued attendance at an event, for instance, is an indication of an outcome. But just the raw numbers themselves, like if you have one class or one program about mind in the making and you count the number of people who attend it, that in and of itself is probably just an output. And so I'm going to ask Jo to go ahead and advance to the next slide and talk about outcomes and how that's different and how you can keep those two straight in your mind.
I will, and I just wanted to point out that at your webinars in August, one of the examples that someone suggested was Jeannie down in Whitehall, and she's doing a chapter by chapter kind of book club with her community of caregivers and folks who work with young children using the Mind in the Making book. And so if you look at her as an example, that project that she started down in Whitehall, the number of events that she's having and the number of attendees is a good example of an output. Oops, sorry. I will get this to work. There you go.
All right, thanks, Jo. So as Jo mentioned, we are using Jeannie's project to kind of discuss how you measure project success. And these are the outcomes that the group came up with during that second webinar about planning your project. One of the tricks that I use when I'm trying to determine whether or not I'm dealing with an outcome or an impact or even an output is after I've written sort of my definition of success, what I hope I achieve, I kind of go back through the outcomes and I ask myself, is this a change in knowledge? Is this a change in attitude? Is this a change in behavior? What's going on here with the individual user? Or it could also be a change in status. I should mention that as well, which is kind of oftentimes a high level outcome. It's like the example I believe I gave even in that second webinar was maybe someone goes from being unemployed, uses library or community resources and becomes employed. That's a change in status. So as you look at these in this particular slide, I'm just going to kind of ask you to think about, utilize the different perspective of the mixed group to create a bigger world and a broader view as these people interact. And Jo and Pam, since you are attending, I'll ask you to kind of play along with me. What is this? Is this a change in knowledge or behavior? Is this an outcome?
Let me think about this. Utilize the different perspectives of the mixed group to create a bigger world and broader view. I would call that an outcome because it's certainly a change in attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was going to say also.
And so it's interesting because I kind of lean towards this one being an impact.
Yeah, why is that?
I almost did too.
Did you?
I did. I almost thought it could be an impact, but I went with outcome. But go ahead.
Yeah. It's because if you think about it, it's an entire group of people.
Yeah.
And that group of people coming together. Right. And
yeah.
I would say creating a bigger world and a broader view as these people interact, that's actually what they're doing that benefits the community, right?
Yeah, I think you're right.
So what about the next one? Create connections, understand each other's perspectives.
You go, Pam.
That? Create connections. Again, I wanted to go outcome, but I'm thinking it could be an impact because that could be almost a change in behavior if you understand other people's perspectives.
A change in behavior is really in the purview of outcomes. It's usually pretty easy to measure, and some of these things might be, I would actually move toward impacts too, because I think it is beyond the individual person attending that discussion group, and much more about especially the creating connections part, much more about what's going to happen down the road based on that person's engagement in that activity. So I'm going to lead toward impacts.
And this was one I actually also struggled with because I think it's a combo.
Mm.
I think that the understand each other's perspectives could be considered an outcome. You know, that an individual comes to understand what another person is experiencing and what their view is of the mind in the making and the work of mind in the making. And the create connections, I lean towards it being a change in behavior and the assumption that it's about individuals who were not connected previously coming together to connect. But I can see where you're coming from in saying that's an impact. And that's actually one of the points I wanted to make for the people that are viewing this recording is it can get really easy to get wrapped up in the vocabulary and stress out about outcomes and impacts and what are we doing here. Don't be. You will learn. That's what I have found as I've started to use these at the state library. The outcome statements that I wrote early on probably were a combination of impacts and outcomes. I am getting better at them, and so will you. And you will get better at even writing outcomes that you can more easily measure. And that's something that Jo mentioned when I asked about what do you think about this one is she's like, that could be hard to measure. And that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean you should shy away from it and don't be afraid of it. But the one thing I would encourage you to do as you go through this and you write outcomes is kind of start out small and give yourself some success and the confidence that comes with that success, and then kind of push yourself to go a little bit farther next time. Like, for instance, I'll just jump down and say, learn a common vocabulary to keep mind in the making concepts present in our community. This is an interesting one, and we're going to talk about it when we talk about how you measure outcomes. But that's something you could probably measure and
Sure.
would be a small victory
Mm.
that would allow you to kind of say, okay, so next time I want to know, do they really understand better how children learn? Okay, next time I want to know, how do they use this? You know, that maybe is the long-term outcome, right? I think people mentioned this on that second webinar, is people wanted the participants in their programs to use what they learned in Mind in the Making for the benefit of children. And use it and implement it so that children were exposed to these concepts. And that's a great outcome and a powerful outcome, but it is a little bit harder and takes a little bit more work on your end to make happen.
I often find when I actually get to the point that we're in today's webinar where I'm designing the way that I'm going to evaluate my success and measure my success, I have to rewrite my outcome statement a little more clearly, a little more focused. And that's a good exercise when you're working through all the way to how am I going to measure this? How am I going to be able to tell my board, my community, that this activity that I did in my library had these results? And when I get down to that point of actually trying to measure, I give myself the latitude to go back and revise my outcome statement, not to make it less, but to make it clearer and more focused.
I do the same thing, Jo. I think it's kind of just part of the natural learning process. And, you know, sometimes I have sort of an idea of what success looks like in my head. And I know for me in particular, it might be like a grand idea. And then when I come down to how do I measure it, then I am trying to be practical, trying to merge those two things. And I think that's normal. So if you will, for me, if you'll go to the next slide, we'll kind of talk a little bit more about measuring outcomes.
And I just wanted to point out that, you know, we kind of started to dance around this, but in many ways it's when we're starting to look for that evidence, that then you're definitely in the outcomes realm when you can say, oh, okay, so I know I've gotten here when I see this kind of evidence.
Mm-hmm. And I just realized I learned something new. I'll tell you after the session, but it has to do with how Office 365 works because I changed some of the slides and they're different.
Oh,
So,
I'm sorry.
No,
Oops.
that's okay. I learned something. So as Jo kind of mentioned, what we're doing here is we're looking for evidence that these outcomes were achieved. And that's why you want to kind of take the time to think about, okay, how will I know they've learned a common vocabulary? Or how will I know that they understand how children learn? And as you begin to kind of jot notes about how you will know that becomes the evidence that you are looking for. And it's evidence that you can use to kind of analyze your project and to see what is working well about it, and maybe what's bombed or what's just not working well. And then also what follow-up is needed. And I think that's something, we have determined, and Joe and I were having a great conversation before we started this recording about the Mind in the Making cohort and how things are going for you, and maybe what support you need from us to kind of begin to implement this work. And so that's how you use the evidence that you have. So if you go ahead and advance, Joe.
To go.
All right. So we kind of talked about evidence and how you can use evidence to measure your success. And there's a term that you might see in the nonprofit world or might have even heard in the library world as well, and it's called an indicator. And an indicator is what I mentioned previously. It's how do you know that they've learned a common language? How do you know that they understand how children learn better? That evidence can also be called an indicator, and it is a measure of success, and it's a way that you can measure your outcomes to see if they've been achieved. So how do you actually gather information about indicators? And these are just some ways that you can look for that evidence that your project is making a difference and is actually creating the change that you hope it is creating. There are pros and cons to each of these, and honestly, it could be a day-long course just talking about each of these. In fact, there are college courses built around gathering this data. Despite maybe some of the limitations of them, I wouldn't hesitate to use them. I think they'll be very valuable. You can use feedback from the participants. You can just ask them about their experiences. You can observe them, and some people are hesitant to do this for a variety of reasons, and some of that is just discounting our own observations, but your observations do count, as do theirs. You can look for signs of activities that have occurred directly or indirectly. So for instance, in Jeannie's Mind in the Making example, if she has a daycare provider who's attending her Mind in the Making session, who then goes and practices an exercise or something from that book and comes back and reports on it, that's an activity that appears to have occurred because of the Mind in the Making chapter discussion. It may not be the only reason, but it is one possible reason. And then don't be afraid to use established research. And this is where this early learning and Mind in the Making stuff, it has a lot of national research that you can use as evidence for not just outcomes, but also impacts, which I'll talk about more in just a few moments. But you can use this national research as evidence of what the outcomes achieve and the impacts that they might make. So let's just talk really quickly about impacts. Impacts are the hardest, and I kind of moved that, utilize the different perspectives of the mixed group to create a bigger world and a broader view as these people interact into an impact. There may be other impacts, and that national research that you had, it may indicate impacts of this early learning work. So I would say national research isn't just something that you can refer to measure your project success. It's also how you can communicate it and even how you can identify kind of the big picture, what you are trying to achieve. Impacts are harder, and that's why I spent most of my time talking about outcomes. Don't stress. Use that national research to communicate the impact of early learning work. But if you do happen to see evidence of an impact, if an individual comes to you and talks to you about how this work has made a real difference in their life and how they're using it in the community, record that. That's wonderful to have that information and to have it on the local level. But do know as you go through this process, you'll probably spend a fair amount of your time on those outcomes because they're a little bit more within our kind of sphere of influence and what we can do to figure out whether or not we are achieving success. And so I'm going to come back to this big 3+ questions that you saw earlier, in that you're going to use all of this evidence and all of this data that you've gathered from outcomes and impacts to review your work, to see what went well so you can repeat it, to improve things, to follow up as needed, and then I would say ultimately to be able to communicate what difference this made, either in the life of an individual user, which is that outcome, or for your community as a whole, and in this case, the children that you serve. So if this is kind of interest to you, these are some references and reading materials that might help you. This concept of writing outcomes, thinking about outcomes and measuring them has been around for a while. It's something the nonprofit world is quite used to doing, and so these can be some resources for you if you'd kind of like to get better at writing outcome statements and measuring them. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jo.
I just one plug for that Shaping Outcomes self-paced tutorial. That was one of the first things I did when I started working here at the State Library some years ago to try to get refresh my memory and see what how this lingo is used. And I think it's really well done. It takes you can kind of do it on your own. It's just really well put together, and it's all based on the IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services model for writing outcomes. And I've become a much better outcome writer, I think, since I took that course. So highly recommend it. And it's fun. It's a fun course. So yeah, I'll go to the next slide and we can focus more now on actually evaluating the training activities you might be doing at the library. And this is my section because I'm not a librarian. I am an instructional designer by training, and I love to evaluate training. I'm very strange that way. And I always come back to this particular model. And one of the things I really like about using the Kirkpatrick model as a way to evaluate training is that I think it jives really well with the logic model. In fact, I'm going to show you a little trick. I picked up a suggestion that I've passed along that suggests that you can use this Kirkpatrick model kind of backwards to help you frame your logic model. So we're going to go forward through it, and then we're going to go backwards through it. So hold on tight, buckle in for a ride through the Kirkpatrick model, which I'm just going to shorten down and start calling the K model. So this model has actually been in place it was designed for workplace training, and by a professor from University of Wisconsin, and many decades ago. I mean, I believe he started in the 50s, but it's been in place. It's rock solid. It's been used for decades, and basically he said, you know, when you're evaluating training, it's pretty easy to evaluate what your learners' reactions are to that training. You can ask them, did you like the training? And they will say yes or no. They mostly will say yes, but they'll say, well, you know, the room was too cold, or the presenter didn't really give enough practical examples. That's the reaction level of training. And we're going to go through these in a little more detail. But then at the learning level is more at that outcomes-based level, and learning and behavior. And then results is really what impact is this having in workplace productivity, the overall productivity of the company. That's what he was measuring at the results level. And of course, that's what companies who planned workplace training really wanted. They wanted to make more money. They wanted to gain more efficiencies. And so this is the model that we're going to look at today and see how it actually might apply to some of the things we're doing. So I want to go to that next slide. So at that reaction level, again, we're just suggesting a method. Here's to collect reaction level data. So I'm going to ask you, Pam, Tracy, can you suggest, Ashley, I see you've joined us. Can you suggest a way that you can find out whether your participants, what their reaction is to the training, how they felt about it? How would you do that?
Well, there's always surveying.
That would exactly. You can have a little
Darn it,
questionnaire
that's
as
exactly what I was going to say. Share this little bean counter.
Yes. A little bean count. Yeah, you could just, we have that all the time, right? You go to a training, at the end of the training, there's an evaluation form, and the evaluation form says, you know, did you like the training, or, did you enjoy the training, or did you learn something at training? That's all reaction level. There's no real proof that anybody has actually learned anything, but you're getting their feeling for it. And that's important. It's super easy data to collect. I've even seen, and I'm sure you guys have probably experienced this too, you go to a training and they have smiley faces on the evaluation, and if you really liked it, or you can put click how many stars you'd give this trainer or this presentation. So it can be really super simple. There's no reason not to collect data at the reaction level, just to make sure you're making an impact. I mean, some people say, no, I hate this. Then maybe you need to make a correction in what you're offering. So it's worthwhile to spend time, because it's super easy to collect data at the reaction level. So let's go look at the learning level. So now, can you suggest a method to collect the learning level of evaluation data? Now we're going to want to know, has that person actually acquired a new knowledge or a new skill? How would you know?
I guess there's observation, noticing how they interact after the training, or if their behavior has changed.
Yes. So you, as the trainer or the person who organized the training, can notice that something's happening, that somebody is, you've done a training on a mind in the making, and you notice that they are, they tell you, oh, this is really interesting. This made me think about this other thing. And now I've changed a little bit about the way that I do something because of that training. They've reported that to you, so that's information directly from the participants. But another way is you might just observe them doing something differently, and that's perfectly legitimate too. So there are ways to a little harder than the reaction level, admittedly, but at the learning level, you can collect that. You might also have on your evaluation form, if you have an evaluation form, you might ask, this is one of the questions that we ask on our forms to try to get at this learning level. We ask, well, what takeaway do you have? What single takeaway do you have from this training? What can you tell us that was, that you're going to take back to your library? And people will often put in, I didn't realize how important it is to build in time for kids to, reflect and do this. And so that's evidence that they've got new knowledge, right? They've reported that. So we can get that information in a questionnaire too. You might observe it, or you might get it another way. So now let's look at the next level. This is an actual change in behavior, still what we think of as an outcome, not necessarily a impact, but an outcome. But at the behavior level, can you think of how will we know over at Missoula Public Library, because I used Pam's photo in here, how will we know that Pam came to this Mind in the Making training and that she's actually instituting a change in behavior? How can I collect that data? Any ideas?
Well, they're probably observing if there's any programming that reflects the training, I suppose.
Yes. So if I'm able to get to Missoula and see Pam's story times, and she's actually implementing some of the Mind in the Making principles, and that would be one way I could observe it. But I could also ask her for a project report, and she'll tell me how she's doing it, right? That's the way that we
Oh yeah,
actually, yeah.
for sure. There's always the straightforward method, which is very handy.
Yes, it is. So that's the behavior level. So Pam, we asked Pam, how are you implementing this in Missoula? And she says, well, I'm planning training activities with childcare providers and getting them trained up in mind in the making. And we bought lots of the books that we're handing out to parents or whatever. Those are all changes in behavior, things that they did differently after the training than they did before the training. So we are certainly, with this project, we are evaluating at that level because we keep asking all of you guys to give us updates on what you're doing and how you're implementing this and trying to support you through these webinars as we get through there. So we're very actively evaluating mind in the making training at the behavior level. So now let's go to the actual results level. So this is a little harder. How do we know that all of this training is actually making a difference in kids' lives and in parents and families' lives?
Wow, that.
It is, yeah. That's exactly the correct. It is
This
hard.
would be
like,
like
I
a
don't know.
long-term thing. You'd
Yeah,
have
this is
to.
like, am I by myself? Am I it?
Yeah,
Does
we
somebody
have
else
a.
get picked
Yeah,
on?
we're just.
Darn it.
That's okay,
Okay.
Ashley. Think of yourself as charmed and yeah, we have pretty low turnout here this month, but this is a hard topic. So well,
Well,
hopefully,
for the results, you see your story time families quite a bit, and you can definitely see the developments the kids make as they go, like whether they go from being shy to more outgoing.
more participatory
Yes.
and then if a mom reports to you, that her kid is was having problems with in preschool or kindergarten and they improve, wow, that's it, right? We're actually seeing kids who are maybe having improved attention spans, or you might see that too in your story times. So,
Oh, for sure. I have indeed.
yeah.
A sweet little boy named Trevor who couldn't form words while he was speaking. Like he was trying to, like really, really trying. Um, but he's gone through speech therapy. He hasn't missed a story time, and he can't get him to stop actually talking. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, we do have that evidence does exist. It may be a little hard to capture because it's not just a evaluation form that you hand out and have people complete, but it's out there, and our challenge then is just to capture that information and put it in a place where we can retrieve it. So Trevor's now in the recording for this webinar, so we have that information. So
Yes, we have
that's
a
excellent.
Trevor.
Okay. So, next slide, Tracy, if you could scooch through. So let's talk about how I've discovered this. Somebody pointed it out to me, and I find it a wonderful trick to use sometimes, using this K model backwards to plan your training. So talking about Trevor, his increased attention span and his improved executive functions are helping him with his actual speech formation, which we know is just a critical skill. And so that's a result that we can see in an individual child, but we could also see results in the community of caregivers who are maybe using some of these concepts and principles. So now my question is to you, Ashley, thinking about that, what is the behavior in a child that you need to see, or the behavior in an adult, so the adult caregiver for that child, that you need to see in order to get that result with a child? So if you're working with that caregiver or parent, what changes in behavior in them do you need to see for their child to benefit?
Probably more direct involvement in
Yeah,
general.
yeah.
Involvement is key in absolutely anything, I would imagine.
Yes. So the
Yeah.
parent is more engaged with the child and has and
Mhm.
more and has some more strategy, applying some more strategies and tools um, uh, with that kid when they're interacting with them. So those are the behaviors that you need to change. So then go backwards. So with that parent, in order to get that behavior, what kind of training or learning do they need to have in order to make that change in behavior?
Well,
They need the information, right?
they do. They need the information. They need to learn about the wonderful book that I have read and learned all about.
Exactly. So there's, and then what kind of, we can go back to the reaction, but basically you can see how we're using this backwards. If you know what you really want in the end, you can think about what behaviors will lead to that result. What kind of learning will support that behavioral change? And then at the reaction level, what does it take to get them to want to come and participate in this, to like the idea about making these opportunities, taking advantage of these opportunities and learning something new and then changing their behavior. So using the K model backwards kind of helps us understand what we need to do to get to that result. So it's just a neat trick. I actually didn't learn it till pretty recently, and when someone pointed it out to me, I went, aha, that is really pretty cool. And we do that here at the State Library. When we're planning and working on logic models, we'll sometimes look at our evaluation and then plan backwards from it. So just wanted to point that out. It's a neat little trick. Next slide. So we want you all to share your data. And I just want to point out that in the greater world of librarianship and research and child development, we learn a lot from each other. And so these webinars are intended to provide you with some additional training, but also to keep giving all of our participants an opportunity to share our data. So we're going to keep getting you guys together, keep trying to anyway, so that you all can continue to share what you're learning along the way, what's working, what's not, and to keep tips. And this is really important in the greater scheme of things, because what we learn for ourselves is fine, but by helping our colleagues learn from what we're observing, we contribute to the greater good. So it's an important part of the process of measuring our success is sharing the results. So I encourage you to write not a letter, but an article for Focus about what you're doing, or write, in your progress reports to us, tell us it's okay to share these, so we'll put things into our annual report. Go do a presentation at an MLA event or at one of our future training events, and get out there and share what you're doing and what you're discovering. Really important part of the process. And finally, Tracy, next slide. Your questions and comments.
I have none. I think I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a fluke that I was able to actually make the meeting today. It was like, crap, sorry.
I think we probably have encountered that a lot of people's schedules have changed since we set up the summer webinars. We probably need to reschedule them for different time frames, because we didn't. October's kind of, what worked and what didn't work. Nothing worked. No, we really didn't have very good attendance. So we'll work with Amelia to get that, try to get that sorted out.
Yeah, we did a little play series here in Havre. We had maybe it was only 4 children, 4 guardians, and I think it might have been 3 or 4 caregivers, because they were able to get credit for showing up, and if they stayed long enough. I feel that it went pretty well. The kids that did show up were really excited and really engaged, and it got them asking questions, particularly about some foamy blocks. They're like, well, wait, do these float? They're made of foam. And so I filled up the sink in the meeting room, and they got to mess with that too. So it does work. It's a good time. I'm really excited for the dramatic play one that we're going to do in January. So they get to be a little let loose a little more.
There'll be costumes, I assume.
Oh, yes, I've been making masks. I'm going to be working on these tutus that you make with headbands and spools of tulle and all that. Gonna try and get together a little cooking set.
Take some pictures.
I will remember to do that this time.
Yeah, good. For cooking and food stuff, you might check with Imagine If, with Martha and Imagine If. They do a lot at their library with
Ooh.
cooking, and so does from Kathy Brandvold from Valier. She does her after school program. The kids get to cook, I think, at least once a week. And so she might
Yeah,
have
that
some
sounds
good
like a good
ideas for
time.
you. And I think she doesn't have a lot of space, but she says she has to be really creative to make room for it. So,
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for that. I will. What was that again? Where's my darn? Of course, I don't have a pen.
no, it's okay. Kathy from Valier, and
Valier.
check with Megan or Martha at Imagine If in Kalispell. Do you have any other suggestions, Pam, for
Valier.
people who are doing cooking projects in the library?
I don't. That's not something I hear a lot about. So it was really nice to hear your suggestions because I haven't come across that.
Kathy, I think most of the stuff she does is either on a hot plate or in a microwave oven. I mean, she's really pretty bare bones.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I actually got in a book recently about cooking with kids. It shares how to do what to assign littler ones, what to assign preteens, and all that. And getting together in the kitchen is a good time, from my personal experience, anyway.
Yes, very good stuff. I think that's all we had for you today, so I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. Thanks. Right.